Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know that we've started a series on philosophy of mind and today we're conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will talk about the concept of externalist and internalist accounts of mental state. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Ajay Verma. Dr. Verma is Associate Professor in Center for Philosophy, School of Social Sciences, JNU. Without further ado, I would like to welcome Sir to our studios and request him to start the lecture. Welcome, Sir.
Thank you. Hello viewers, so as you're already aware, we have been dealing with different ideas, different notions, different themes in philosophy of mind in this series. And in this series we have already spoken on several different takes on the issue, ranging from the relationship between mind and body and the nature of mental states, the relationship between brain and mind, and so on and so forth. But most of these accounts, as we have seen, in the past, are centered around on this premise that there is this part, there is experiential part of reality, and then it has to belong to something. And it has to be owned, it has to be owned somewhere, and that creates a kind of duality, which we have been examining in different ways in philosophy of mind. But then apart from such exercises, there is yet another work that as thinkers in philosophy of mind we can engage ourselves with, and this task could be to define, to look at the very nature of mental states, along with its peculiarities, and the kind of philosophical implications, the kind of philosophical questions it raises, and so on and so forth. So first of all, let's look at the equation in terms of maybe epistemology, or in terms of theory of knowledge, in the sense that when we have knowledge, then knowledge is always of something, and it seems to and it seems to belong somewhere. Starting from Kant, Kant talks about the idea of unity of a perception. So a perception, that this is something I perceive, and sort of that kind of reflective awareness about knowing something, it has to belong somewhere, and which requires some kind of idea of the notion of I, the notion of subject, knowing subject, so to speak. So the equation goes something like this. I mean, there are sort of there are these knowledge states, which are kind of abstract in nature. And since knowledge is generally about something, so knowledge has an object of knowledge, and then it belongs somewhere, generally, to the subject, which could be defined in terms of consciousness. So now, knowledge could also be looked at, especially after Husserl, after Brentano, followed by Husserl. There is a different kind of methodology emerged of not only the subject matter of study, but also in terms of methodology. So in terms of object of study, and the idea was in phenomenology that we should bracket out everything which includes the natural attitude towards something, and we should natural attitude would mean that knowledge is always of something physical, of something over and apart from the knowledge episode. So knowledge means knowledge of something, and then knowledge has to arise somewhere, it has to be owned somewhere, and therefore in this very idea of the subject who knows. But in phenomenology, there are two main assumptions that came into the picture, which were that first of all, this very idea of there being something external to phenomena, something external to the content of perception, so to speak. That idea, Husserl believed, and phenomenologists generally believed, that is an idea that's coming from outside, and therefore we could discount it, we could work without it. There's something that could be bracketed out. So we need not bother about what the knowledge is knowledge of. What does it belong to? What does it refer to in so to speak, the natural world, the physical world? So the very idea of natural world or physical world, whether it's there or is not, that very question is instead of being answered, it's just discounted. That for all that we have before us, this question doesn't so to speak concern us, because philosophy should concern itself what is given to us, the minimal given, which is, according to phenomenologists, the phenomena, the so to speak first person account of things, the first person experience of the world, the first person experiential reality. If there is reality to that it needs to be examined, that's experiential reality, and that experiential reality appears before us in terms of phenomena. So, the reason why we're talking about phenomenology in this context is because if phenomena is all there is before us to look at, to study, then the very idea of the where does it belong, in the sense what does it refer to, and in terms of outside world, that those questions could be discounted. Similarly, another idea that comes forth from phenomenology is that consciousness is not something self-enclosed, independent in itself. Consciousness is always defined by its intentionality. It always has. It always has some kind of pointedness, in the sense that consciousness always points towards something, and it arises in the very act of it's being about something. So consciousness is essentially, so to speak, intentional. So now, what kind of implication does it hold for philosophy of mind? The implication that it holds for philosophy of mind is that basically as minds, as instances of consciousness, we relate to the world through what could be called mental states. So mental states are, so to speak, intermediaries for us. And so we relate to the world in terms of, as discussed earlier, what we call propositional attitudes. So there could be some kind of propositions about the world, that the grass is green and the sky is blue, and any number of them. And we could have some kind of propositional attitudes. So, say for example, I believe that the grass is green. I desire that the sky were cloudy, and so on and so forth. So there is a way of relating to certain propositions about the world. And these these propositions, and we relate to them in terms of our attitudes. So there are propositional attitudes, and there are qualitative states which together account for what we call mental states. So to read from a book by Neil Campbell. Mental states fall into two categories: propositional attitudes and qualitative states of consciousness. Propositional attitudes include mental states such as beliefs, desires, fears, doubts, and so on. They are states that involve an attitude, believing, desiring, etc., toward an actual or possible state of affairs, for example, that Greece will win the European Cup. Thus, one may be said to believe, desire, fear, or doubt that Greece will win the European Cup. So the idea here is, as said earlier, there could be some propositions like Indian cricket team would win the World Cup next time, and we may have some kind of propositional attitudes towards it, like I believe that they would win, I desire that they would win, I doubt that they would win, and so on and so forth. And all these propositional attitudes refer to some kind of mental states. So belief is a mental state, desire is a mental state, fear, doubt, all these count as mental states. And now, as opposed to propositional attitudes, there could also be qualitative states, which would also count as mental states. So what are qualitative states? Qualitative states of consciousness, on the other hand, are the intrinsic, felt qualities of experience, such as the painfulness of pain, the redness of the sensation of red, and so on. While there are important differences between these two kinds of mental states, we noted that they share one essential feature, namely intentionality. So, qualitative states could be of two kinds. One is, propositional attitudes, and the other are qualitative states, like being sad, being happy, and so on and so forth. But both, something that is common to both these states is that they have one essential feature, that is namely that of intentionality. That they are about something. So there's an aboutness about this, about both these states. So whereas propositional attitudes are about something, about some state of affairs, actual or possible in the world, and the kind of attitude, the kind of relationship, mental relationship we may form about them, and then qualitative states are like some kind of something more complete. Which is in a certain way kind of self-referential and self-settled most of the times, not necessarily always. So, say for example, happiness, is some kind of feeling, and something something of a different kind than propositional attitudes. So there is like this though there being difference between propositional attitudes and qualitative states of consciousness, one commonality is that they share one essential feature, which is intentionality. So, what do we mean when we say they have this feature of intentionality? It means that this is the relation of aboutness. Intentionality is a kind of relation of aboutness that Franz Brentano claimed is common to all mental states, and is what, in his views, distinguishes the mental from the non-mental. Even false beliefs and visual hallucinations have this feature. For example, if Shahana believes that angels exist, her belief is about non-actual state of affairs, that angels exist. Similarly, if another person, Seema, has taken a narcotic and hallucinates that she is a Bollywood star, then she is aware of her imagined stardom. So the idea is that whether we are talking about an actual state of affairs, or we are talking about non-actual state of affairs, there is some kind of a content to it. So mental states, have some kind of content, about them. That's the basic idea. So, say for example, even when we believe that angels exist, in terms of the mental content, the person is relating, so to some kind of belief that angels do exist. Similarly, even if the stardom of Seema in this example is something imagined, but it forms some kind of mental content nevertheless, to which the subject here, Seema, relates to in a certain way. So there is some kind of intentionality involved, whether irrespective of whether what you are relating to is an actual state of affairs, whether it forms a part of the natural world, and so on and so forth. So those questions are discounted. We are merely talking about the content of mental states, and how sort of consciousness relates to it, and since the two are related to each other mainly by sort of mental acts or intentionality. So that's the main idea here. So now to understand what exactly is the idea of mental content, let us again read. Let's again read from the same work. Most the quotations that I'm reading here are from Neil Campbell, a little bit changed or as they are. So, according to him, what our mental states are about is more naturally described as mental content. So, the aboutness of mental states gives us the idea of mental content. That is, we can say that the content of Shahana's belief that angels exist, and that the content of Seema's experience is her imagined stardom. Thus, mental content is what part of our beliefs, desires, fears, or some other kind of experiences. What has struck many philosophers about Brentoner's thesis is that the intentionality of mental states implies that they are representational. So, first of all, we need to understand here the idea, of mental content. Still, since mental states are supposed to be about something. So the whatness of mental states, the contextual part of it, is what we would call the mental content. But the another problem that it sort of takes us to is that most often we believe that mental content is representational, meaning that it gives us a picture of something. So when we're talking about mental content, as something that sort of exists in our mind, we also at the same time believe that it's not a picture, that has conjured up all of a sudden from out of nowhere. We often believe that this picture, that we have in our mind, which forms the mental content, is actually representational of something out there. So there's like something that corresponds to it in the natural world, in the world out there somewhere. So to understand it a little bit more, let me read from the same book. Just as a photograph represents the scene it captures, mental states represent the way the world is or could be. We can express the content of Shahana's belief in terms of the notion of representation by saying that through her beliefs, Shahana represents the world as one that contains angels. Brentano's claim that all mental states have intentionality or representational content is a controversial one. While it seems clear that most mental states have representational content, it is far from obvious that all of them do. Consider pain, for example. When I feel pain, I do not appear to be representing a real or imagined object. So, this idea that mental content is always representational of something even when we are sort of forming beliefs on non-existent things, but even in those cases it's representational of something. It could be representational even of an imagined world or a desired world. Say for example, in the case of other example, it could be representational of a desired world where you are a star. So say for example, when Seema wants to believe or hallucinates under the influence that she is a Bollywood star. So her belief, her mental content here is representational of this imagined world where she thinks of herself. She believes that she is a star. So that's the main idea here, but it doesn't say. But there's this notion that Brentano brings into picture. That is always representational. Does not seem to be true. So, say for example, pain. At times, pain doesn't represent some kind of real or imagined object. It does not seem to to have the same kind of transitoriness in terms of its aboutness. So there could be examples like that. So further on. To read from the same work, the painfulness of the pain does not seem to be about anything. It simply exists. The same could be said about moods. Moods are clearly mental states that have a qualitative dimension. It feels a certain way to be happy or depressed, yet it is difficult to associate any particular representational content with such states. So, even though by and large what Franz Brentano seems to be saying through by his notion of intentionality, aboutness of things, and mental states being representational, we seem to have reasons to believe that that's not always true. So there are certain mental states which seem to be purely qualitative in nature, and they seem to be self-referential, self-explanatory in a certain way, and certain feelings like pain and pleasure could be one examples, and moods also could form another set of examples. So moods are like it provides us a kind of a filter, to how we view the world. So if we say, for example, being depressed is not always representational of something. Being depressed is about how what kind of mental attitude in a certain way you have developed, you have formed about the world, which may last for some time, which may last for a duration or whatever. Similarly, there could be moods where say for example, you may if you are in a certain kind of mood, all facts would be considered by you as conducive towards happiness if you are in a happy mood generally. Whereas in the mood of depression, all the, so to speak, facts about the world would be related to by you in a certain way, through a lowly kind of feeling. But moods and certain kind of feelings could act as a counterexample to Brentano's idea that mental states could be, are always representational, or but his idea of intentionality was a kind of a new way of looking at things in terms of in terms of object of examination, and also in terms of methodology, in philosophy. But here, what we from the point of view of philosophy of mind, what we want to look at is that we want to understand what we mean by mental states, and another thing that we want to understand is that mental states could be representational of some things other than that. They could be representational of things outside of them, or another way of thinking about mental states could be mental states as as kind of self-referential, some kind of self-complete kind of a state, and both these considerations would give us two different, would lead us into different directions of looking at mental states within the gamut of philosophy of mind. So now to proceed further from here. So, to talk about how it gives us two different directions towards the study of mental content. So to read again from the same book, those who think that all mental content is representational have attempted to respond to these concerns. They claim that although pains and moods seem to be different from other mental states, they have representational content nevertheless. In case of pain, they propose that this sensation represents the part of the body where the pain is felt and represents it as painful in order to indicate real or imaginary bodily damage. When it comes to moods like depression, it has been suggested that the individual in question represents everything as being worthless, pointless, or uninteresting. The depression then works like a filter that alters the way the world in general is experienced or represented. So one way is that some people could argue that there is mental states are always representational, and they may want to say that includes even states like pain and pain and moods, certain kind of feelings and moods, because there is some kind of aboutness even in those cases. So in the case of pain, the proposal is that this sensation represents the part of a body where the pain is felt. So it has, it's representational of something. It has a particular kind of a location and so on and so forth. And it's representational of some kind of damage or to the body. So, but even in these cases, it is unclear how to evaluate such proposals, and philosophers continue to be divided on this question. Some claim with Brentano that all mental states have representational content. Others admit that while some experiential states are representational, many of them are not. Still others maintain that only propositional attitudes have representational content. Regardless of which of these views is correct, it is clear that many mental states have content. The task philosophers face in that case would be is to understand what makes a mental state have the content it does. The big question here is whether mental content need to be always considered in terms of what it is about. In other terms, whether the mental content is always relational, or whether to believe that mental content like feelings and moods is not always about something, but is rather in a certain way self-referential and is something complete in itself. So here we see that depending on our answers, and there could be different answers to these questions, whether we want to believe that mental contents are always representational of something outside of them, or whether they form a complete kind of a unit, like in the case of Husserl. This is all that we need to look at in philosophy. So even the externality the content is a part of, is also given to us within the mental content, so to speak. It's a part of the phenomena that's there before us. That's there before us. So externality is also in a certain way given in the phenomena. So there could be, these two different ways of looking at mental states, and one of them, would count as externalist approach, to mental states, and the other would count as internalist approach towards mental states. So we'll look at sort of how these approaches differ and are posed against each other. We'll continue with our lecture. We'll return after a short break. Thank you. Welcome back, viewers. So we were talking about externalist and internalist approaches, and we saw how there could be two ways of taking into consideration the very idea of mental content. One could be that you want to view them as always representational of something. So there, in that case, the overall idea would be that that mental content always bears some kind of a relation to where to what it is about. So say for example, in case of say for example propositional attitudes. So it's always about something, and similarly, sort of like all propositions are about some states, some state of affairs. And then, we relate to them in a certain way. So, say, for example, desires are about something. When we believe, then, we believe to be, to be the case. We believe that a certain case is so and so and so on and so forth. So there is an aboutness of mental states, so which is mainly we see in the cases of propositional attitudes. So we cannot say I believe, we cannot stop at that. So beliefs are always about something. I believe that so and so. Similarly, desires, these are kind of from grammatical point of view, these are transitive verbs. They need to have an object. So like desire is always for something. You can stop at saying, well, I desire. So, but at the same time, there could be some other kind of mental states which don't always seem to require, they don't need to be, they don't seem to suffer from some kind of incompletion if we don't talk about their object. So, say for example, moods. Moods are not, transitive in exactly the same way. Somebody could be simply feeling elated, and similarly, somebody could be just feeling down about things. So it does not it does not really refer to something outside of itself always. So moods are like that. And happiness, pleasure, pain, such feelings also many a times could be just there. So without necessarily requiring some kind of object, they are not necessarily representational in the same sense, in the sense that they always require an object, just like most the sort of transitive verbs do. So here, comes into the picture this internalist and externalist debate. So an externalist would hold that all mental states are representational of something. They are representations of something. So this is something of an essential feature of them. So when we take into consideration mental states, then we have to, as a part of that, take into consideration what they are representational of. Otherwise, we are not, sort of properly speaking, not talking about the mental states in completion. So now to have a better idea about this, let me read again from the same book. The most significant debate about mental content is the one between internalists and externalists. The point of disagreement here is about how we should individuate mental states. Individuating mental states is a matter of distinguishing mental states that are the same for those that are different. Such as the belief that the sky is blue from the belief that grass is green. Obviously, the content of mental states plays a central role here. We usually distinguish between the belief that sky is blue and the belief that grass is green is by pointing out that the content of these states is different, since one is about the sky and the other is about grass. Agreeing on the factors that determine mental content is crucial if we were to use mental content as a means of individuating mental states. So this question about internalism and externalism, especially comes into the picture because mental states, also sort of are an important factor about how we individuate mental states. So say for example, there is a particular mental state belonging to the belief that the grass is green, and there would be a particular mental state which would belong to the idea that sky is blue. Now certainly there has to be some kind of a difference between these two mental states. And if we believe them to be the same, then that would lead us into some kind of contradiction. It cannot be the case that that everything in the world could be sort of stated through the same proposition and through the same mental content. That cannot be the case. That would mean that we have found some single mental state which defines everything in the world. So that would be more of imagination rather than reality. So individuation can be done always vis-a-vis something. So since the mental state that grass is green, of belief that the grass is green, and the mental state of a belief that the sky is blue, there has to be some kind of difference in terms of which we individuate these two mental states. And that individuation has to be done in terms of their aboutness. What are they stating to be the fact, or what they are representational of? So this way, especially for individuation of mental states, to set them against each other, to be able to differentiate between different mental states, we require some basis, and that require any account of such differences, any reasons for believing in such differences would lead us to something outside of these mental states, in terms of which the difference could be accounted for. So individuation of mental states is an important factor where when it comes to internalism and externalism debate, in especially with reference to mental states. Now to look further into the debate, let me read again a quote from Neil Campbell. Internalists and externalists have quite different approaches to this issue. Internalists claim that the content of mental state is primarily a matter of feature intrinsic to the person who has it. Externalists, on the other hand, think that what a mental state is about is primarily a relational matter. To appreciate what distinguishes internalists from externalists, we need a better understanding of the difference between intrinsic and relational properties. So the basic difference between internalist and externalist approach is that an externalist would say that all the different mental states, since mental states are different, and especially otherwise if there were no differences between mental states, there was no question of individuating them, there wouldn't have been different propositions about the world. So to account for differences, we need to essentially go outside of the mental content and consider them in terms of what these mental states are about. So here in this case we would be looking at mental states as essentially representational. And their being representational of something would necessarily bring them into relation with something outside of themselves. Whereas internalist would, claim that mental state is something, is something that's intrinsic to the person who has it. So it forms a complete kind of a unit in itself. So just like in say for example Husserl's phenomenology, all we need to look at is phenomena, and phenomena is complete. It forms a kind of a complete unit. And there are only two sides of the equation. There is phenomena and consciousness, intending towards the phenomena. So internalists somewhat similarly claim that the content of a mental state is primarily a matter of features in which are intrinsic to the person who has them, and to understand this difference better between the internalist and externalist approaches, we need to look at different ways of looking at properties. Properties could be intrinsic or relational. So now, to understand the difference between the intrinsic and relational properties, let me read from the same book. Intrinsic properties are characteristics that things have in isolation from other things. The size of your brain, the fact it is composed primarily of nervous tissues, and whether or not you have an appendix are all examples of intrinsic properties. These are properties you have regardless of your surroundings or relationships to other things or people. Relational properties, by contrast, are entirely a matter of relationships between things. Two examples of relational properties are being next to and being an ant, and these are examples both taken from Neil Campbell's Brief History of Philosophy of Mind. So now this gives us a slightly better picture of what we mean by intrinsic properties and relational properties, and there's also reminiscent of the difference between primary and secondary properties that Locke first discussed. So there, if we remember that primary properties are something that belong to the object independently of anything else. So and secondary qualities is are those which though have the object as a source of it, but nevertheless depend upon are relational in a certain way to our relative. To the subject who's perceiving them, though we should mind here that being relative to and being relational are two different ideas. We shouldn't confuse the two. So intrinsic properties are certain properties, certain characteristics that things have in themselves, in isolation from other things. Those characteristics are not dependent on anything else. So, say for example, there is a certain bodily constitution that we have. Initially, we depended on our parents for that, but then once you are born, you are a completely independent physical unit. So you're having a mind, you're having a sort of brain rather, all other physical attributes. Is this something that you have independently of anything else? It's not that your body is always existing in relation to table or particular table or chair around you, such that if something happens to the table, something would happen to your body too. That happens only in magic and fairy tales. So intrinsic properties are properties that that an object has independently of anything else. Whereas relational properties are always a matter of relationships between things, like being next to. So if I say that I'm next in the queue, that means I'm talking about my position in relation to somebody else, or being an ant. So you like being an ant would mean that you have a nephew or a niece. It's a kind of a relational property. As a matter of fact, somebody may become an ant without even knowing it. So the news may come to you later that now you have become an aunt. So properties like being next to, being an aunt, are relational properties in that sense. So it's a property which requires two objects, and if the one object is sort of not taken into consideration, this property would become nonsensical. So this is the main difference between intrinsic and relational properties. So now, to contextualize this difference, in the internalist and externalist debate, let me again read from the same source. So when internalists claim that mental content is a matter of the intrinsic properties of a thinker, they mean that the content is determined by physical processes inside the thinker's body, such as their brain states. Externalists, by contrast, claim that the content of a mental state is primarily a matter of relationships to things outside the thinker, such as the linguistic community, their causal or evolutionary history, or even their physical environment. Thus, the debate between the internalists and externalists is often put in terms of the question: is mental content a matter of what is going on in one's head? Internalists claim it is. Externalists deny this. So, when we are talking about, so the idea here is when we are talking about, certain mental episodes, do we consider them always, existing as in relationship with something else, or, we sort of consider them to be independently there inside our head, and to look at them, to study them, all we need to do is just to look at to look at the mental content, without reference to anything over and apart from those mental states. So if we want to look at them independently of anything outside of them, then we are taking some kind of an internalist approach. If we believe that it's a matter of, it's completely a matter of what is going on inside our heads. But if we believe that, it's more than that, and since, mental states are about something, and, that means mental states give us a description of something, and description is always of certain states of affairs, and state of affairs are out there. They are not completely exhausted by the content of the mental state, so to speak. Therefore mental states in that sense are essentially relational. So they're, being so and so, it is dependent upon, what they refer to, what they are about, and so on and so forth. And also, importantly, it also brings into the picture the entire epistemic value of mental states. So if we believe that, or rather epistemological value, or we could say epistemic status of mental states. So say for example, if we take an internalist approach, then like the questions regarding truth and falsity of those mental states, if all we need to take into consideration is that they are there inside the mind and they're independently there, and they're just simply inside our heads, and that's it. So then, these questions regarding truth, falsity, certain epistemological questions, which includes, as in theory of knowledge, the criteria of justification. So as it's called JBT, justification, belief, and truth. So the sort of the idea of truth, the epistemic value that we attach to it, all these considerations in a certain way are discounted, or in a certain way, are not seriously taken into consideration in the same way as probably in the case of externalists. So that is another very important difference in terms of epistemological difference between these two takes on the issue. Now, that also brings, when we talk about the truth or falsity of it, then, that's something that immediately comes into the picture is also, the causality of our beliefs. So, what exactly, is the reason behind our our mental states? What are they caused by? So, say for example, hallucinations. Hallucinations don't have a factual counterpart. So we would say, or cases of error, cases of illusions. So they have a mental content, but they don't. That mental content vis-a-vis the actual state of affairs, vis-a-vis what has caused it, are false. So, say for example, when we say, the classical example in philosophy is, erroneously seeing a rope as a snake. So when we say, well, look at that, there is a snake out there, and on a closer examination, on a closer look, we find that it's not a snake but a rope, then we know that our judgment that it's a snake was wrong, it was false. It was a kind of a false perception of the thing. So now the falsity or truth of the matter is decided in terms of the actual state of affairs. So whether what caused it, even though the judgment was about snake, the proposition, the belief was that it is a snake, but actually the cause of it was a rope. Therefore, the actual correspondence was not there, was missing. So we formed a judgment about snake caused by the actual physical contents of a rope. So there's a mismatch here, which accounts for the epistemological value of word of the judgment that there is a snake over there. So causality of belief comes into the picture here, and how it plays out in internalist and externalist debate. To find that out, let me read a passage again from the same source. Imagine then that my belief that I am looking at a lemon is caused by an evil scientist. So say, for example, we take an example that I'm seeing a lemon somewhere. So one reason for that, that perception of lemon being there is that there's an actual lemon there, and there are these rays of light being reflected from the lemon, and that makes me see a yellow colored lemon out there. But somebody could want us to imagine that the belief that I'm looking at a lemon is caused by an evil scientist who is stimulating my brain with electrodes. The internalist would claim that so long as the brain processes caused by the scientist are the same as the brain processes that would have been caused by actually seeing a lemon, I come to have the same belief. From my perspective, there would certainly be no difference. Thus, the causal origins of my belief that I am looking at a lemon are very important for determining whether my belief is true or false. But those causal origins do not determine the content of my belief. They have only an epistemic significance, if at all. So the idea here is, and this is an actual sort of suggestion that another famous epistemologist, Jonathan Dempsey, makes. So he wants us to imagine that as if we were a brain in a vat, and somebody were as if stimulating our brains in such a way that we see certain things, because after all, perception of things is this tantamount to having certain kind of experiences. But experiences could be incited purely in terms of certain brain waves, certain synapses, which are at the end of the day are mere electrical impulses, if were to be described in terms of pure physics. So now here, truth value ascribes to the belief that I see that there is a yellow colored lemon over there. That has to be decided on in terms of whether there is one or not. But what about the fact that as far as the actual content of this state of mind, the actual content of this mental state is concerned, it is irrespective of what is causing it. There could actually be there could actually be a lemon out there which is sort of exciting the roads and cons in our eyes in a certain way that make us see a lemon there, which actually as a matter of fact is there. But at the same time, this mental state could be also induced by in some other ways, say for example mainly through electrical impulses. So the causal origins of the content of my belief would be equal, would have equal status in terms of what is causing it. So even if if somebody is stimulating my certain brain states in me, then also I see a lemon out there. And another case could be that there is actually a lemon out there because of which I'm seeing one. But from the point of view of the origins of the belief in terms of its content, it's irrelevant. If we just want to look at purely in terms of mental content, discounting the idea of what it is about. So there, the question of what is causing those beliefs, what is causing those mental content, doesn't form an essential part of the explanation. Though in sort of from the point of view of epistemology, it could be an important factor, because only that would decide the truth or falsity of the matter. So here, like in today's lecture, we looked at what exactly do we mean by mental content, and what could be the different ways of studying, examining, mental content. We saw how, there we could have an internalist approach towards the towards it, in the sense that we want to take mental content, purely as something in itself, and not something that has to be considered necessarily in relationship to something else. Whereas externalists would look at mental states always in terms of representations, as if they were representational of something that would require us to look at mental states in terms of what they are representative of. So we will talk about it further, and we would look at the different kind of arguments that externalists and internalists offer against each other, but we will have to leave that for the next lecture. Thank you.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Ajay Verma for coming here and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.